For those of you who know me, and I know that I know a lot of you there, you know that personally and professionally, I am really committed to teaching. I have been for my entire career. I've been a scholar, a faculty member, and I've been a library and academic administrator. And so I thought, this is my first opportunity to do something at the annual meeting. And I thought, well, what would be the topic? And I think that for me, the inspiration has always been teaching. And so that's the topic we are going to address today. And we're going to look at it from different perspectives. So what I'm going to ask each of our participants to do is to self-introduce and then to spend 10 minutes saying to us something about their own commitment to teaching, what it means to them, and why it's important to us as we move into the future. The order of presentation will be E.C. Schroeder, Sonja Drimmer, Alex Hidalgo, and Michael Suarez, and their titles are up on the screen for us. So with that, I would like to call upon E.C. Schroeder to start.
So thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's panel. Barbara has asked us, as she said, to introduce ourselves, so this will be very quick. Many of you I know, but for those who don't, my name is noted as E.C. Schroeder, and I have the honor of serving as the director of the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. Although I've been director since 2011, I've been a librarian at Yale for a bit longer, going back to 1989 when I started as a rare book catalog librarian. I entitled my remarks this afternoon, Who Cares? Why and How Libraries Need to Support the Teaching and Study of Bibliography. Much of what I will present this afternoon is not new, but I hope to put a little bit of a framework around the ways that libraries support the teaching of bibliography. And although for an audience like ours today, the value and importance of bibliography is obvious, I hope, in today's university and library environment, this importance is not always recognized, and in fact is often dismissed in terms of its importance. That said, however, over the past 5 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in recognition of the importance of teaching students to using actual books and manuscripts. At RBMS and SAA, there are routinely sessions on teaching of special collections material. University and university library administrators are often excited to hear how students are now in their special collections. It's very much seen as a parent, I think it's trying to justify the college tuition that we currently face. At Yale, certainly, we no longer have to convince faculty that a visit to the Beinecke or one of the other special collections on campus is worthwhile for their class. For example, this academic year, we will host about 600 class sessions at the Beinecke, and my colleagues across other special collections will probably teach an additional 100 sessions. And with the completion of a renovation in 2016 at the Beinecke, we increased our ability to host semester-long classes where nearly every session is hosted at the library using collection material. We are currently averaging between 6 and 8 sessions, 6 to 8 classes per semester, and this semester classes will include medieval hagiography, advanced Latin paleography, race, sex, and gender in downtown New York City, African American literature in the archives, printing for manuscript, visual culture in the American West, and art of memory in the pre-modern world. These are all intense, these are all full-blown classes. Curators, library staff are involved. Often they're working collaboratively with faculty. Sometimes our curators are actually teaching those classes. At the same time, we continue to host one-off sessions, which serve as an important introduction to students as to what is a book, what is a manuscript, what is a photograph, what do you mean I can touch it, what does it look like, how do I do that, what is this little writing on the side. The goal of those classes is to introduce them to make them feel comfortable to come into the library and be willing to come back maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years later. I'll leave to others on this panel to describe specific ways to teach bibliography, and I'll focus a little bit on how a library might support this endeavor. Many of my observations are not new or unique, but I feel that that there's no one way to engage faculty, students, and staff, and every institution needs to be flexible in how they provide that support. Not surprisingly, however, my observations are based on my experience at Yale. So collections. This is perhaps obvious, but crucial to the teaching of bibliography is acquiring and making available collection material that can provide examples, context, and serve as sources for future research, papers, etc. Libraries have the opportunity to acquire a range of material and do so for multiple reasons. And for bibliography, you need to acquire both so-called high spots, but also the everyday item, and often in scale. So collections can play an important role in building that research or that material. So for examples, recent examples that relate to Yale would be Barney Rosenthal's collection of annotated books, the Tansell collection of American imprints that documents the output of 50-plus publishers between 1891 and 1930, collecting every title that they published and ideally every printing. Pulp fiction, particularly in this case most recently African American and LGBTQ. We're also interested more and more in visual material, but also film scripts, TV scripts as well. All sorts of formats that we were not considering 10 years ago, certainly not 25 years ago. And then in addition to we're acquiring long-term research collections and we're looking at long-term preservation, we're also looking at creating a teaching collection of material that can be manipulated, held, bent, and otherwise consumed by students through their handling. So we don't have staff having a coronary as they're watching that handling. Sometimes this is as simple as just finding things at garage sales, eBay, but we also have created facsimiles. One important facsimile we had our conservation lab create was a facsimile of a medieval girdle book. We have a very lovely copy, but it just cannot handle being used on a day-to-day basis anymore. And using it, it allows students to see, well, what is a girdle book? Why would you do it? What does it look like? Why is it hold? Why does it flip open this particular way? So of course, once you have the collection, you can't hide it in the basement. It needs to be cataloged, processed, however you want to do that. And there are questions around standards. One of the challenges that institutions face is not only anticipating research in terms of what we acquire, but also anticipating research in how we catalog. What we thought about that was important 50 years ago, 75 years ago, or even 10 years ago is no longer what we're interested in today. So we need to think about how we catalog in a flexible manner that we're able to recognize at times when we have to go back, but also do it in ways that perhaps getting feedback from researchers themselves or students. We worry about discovery. We worry about how we describe it. Is it accurate? Does it have collation? It has title? Does it have access points? We cite existing bibliographies. And more we want to make it possible that once we catalog that material, those catalog records can be easily taken and used by researchers and scholars to manipulate in ways that we've never thought of. And of course, relating to all this, and I'm not going to touch on this heavily today, is around digitization and the role that digitization can play to supplement cataloging, supplement access, and also just makes it easier for students at 2 o'clock in the morning to do their assignments. I'd like to also highlight the role that staff play, and the role that staff play in teaching bibliography within the library, but also how we teach the staff bibliography. Obviously, staff work with researchers, work with faculty, they catalog, they do reference. They're often working with faculty in terms of discovering what's in the collection. Sometimes faculty don't know, and sometimes librarians don't know what's there. They're working on paleography, they're working on archival processing, they're working on photography. They're conservators who are more and more pulling into the conversations about material that we have in our collections. In addition to supporting teaching by Yale faculty and students, we've also learned to expand that. Not everything can be taught in a classroom setting or taught in a regular academic year. So over the many 15 to 20 years, we've developed a program of master classes or 1-week-long seminars or workshops that help supplement what's being taught in the curriculum. So over the years, this has included descriptive bibliography, typography and design, avant-garde material, film-related material, Italian paleography, medieval music notation, IIIF, the most recent one last year. And next year, or next 2 years, we're looking at doing a master class or a class in conservation science and research. And so how to teach graduate students to ask questions of conservators and scientists in order to discover aspects of the material they're working with that they don't have the skill set. And it's really important to think about what those questions might be, because that's going to feed the work that the conservators can help with as well. We also think of not only workshops, symposiums, but we also think about how exhibits can play a role in bibliography. Sometimes it's subtle. This spring, our exhibit is not so subtle. It's entitled Bibliomania or Book Madness, and it includes 4 sections, including one entitled Collated and Perfect, which is organized in conjunction with the Ransom Center of Texas, that traces the history of the collation statement and the obsession with finding a more perfect text, from the 18th century book collector Thomas Rawlinson through Hinman, the editor of the first folio in 1968. Relating to these exhibits are a wide range of programs that are aimed at the public, students, and faculty that will further explore the exhibit, the materials, and the themes. Finally, I'd like to highlight a few collaborative projects and how we think about bibliography that support bibliography in its teaching. And they reflect a commitment to collaboration, multi-institutional projects, open content, and a recognition that everything takes time, much to my frustration. There are many things such as traditional collaborative databases such as ESTC, Wing, ISTC, the Digital Scriptorium, Papyrus.info, and those are all important roles, but they're all actually, they're sort of aging. They're sort of reaching that point that almost all of them need a reboot. Like, what is their purpose and why are they there? And it's been very interesting to watch how that's being played out across all of those. And it's important because I think as we go and reboot those various databases, it's also thinking about what are the new research questions, what's bibliography need in order to do that. 2 more recent ones I want to highlight. One that many of us, amazing number of us, talked about yesterday afternoon, was material evidence in incunable, which is the goal is to document the history of our incunable collections here in the United States, but also across Europe, as an attempt to try to ask questions that we weren't necessarily asking when many of us acquired our incunable collections, with a focus on copy-specific material, copy-specific information, such as provenance, bindings, where else we received the material, what does it look like, whose hands they've been in, and they're asking all sorts of interesting questions, and there's great little graphs that you can turn up as well. And finally, I'd like to highlight a recent project that we're working on to create an online Black literature bibliography. And we're in the early stages of this, but the goals include to identify examples of Black literature in the United States from the 18th century through potentially the present. One of our big questions is, what is the end date? And to model it in many ways on the BAL. And it's also going to build on the bibliographical work that's gone on in this field over the last 100 years, pulling together many of the amazing sources that people have put together in a paper form. It's also to create an open source framework based on Wikidata that would allow institutions and individuals to contribute titles, holdings, etc. And we work in, one of the very appealing parts about this project is it's been a very close collaboration with faculty at Yale and Rutgers, as well as graduate students, librarians, curators from across institutions in the United States. And finally, the goal is to help teach graduate students, faculty, and librarians the bibliographical skills they need to actively contribute and use this material. And we're pretty thrilled that Mellon has funded us as a preliminary stage that was announced, I think, the end of January. So finally, some takeaways and principles to remember. I like to think of as, start with yes. I got to think flexible, think long-term, be really collaborative, build and acknowledge the work of others, and rarely is there a bad idea. It might need to be tweaked, and there's always a learning opportunity. Many thanks for your time.
Afternoon again. I am Sonja Drimmer. I am Assistant Professor of Medieval Art at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And it's my pleasure to join today's illustrious panel to offer an account of building a teaching collection. And I want to actually start off by acknowledging EC's one of his final takeaways, which was start with a yes. I've been tremendously fortunate to work with librarians at UMass who have begun with a yes, and it's been everything. So my talk is going to draw from my own experience collaborating with my colleagues. Okay, mood lighting, at UMass. But my hope is that those of you in the audience who may have had ideas for doing this at your own institutions will find concrete suggestions for my presentation, and that those of you who never thought before that something like this is possible at an institution with limited funding for these sorts of projects will begin to consider seriously the possibility. And for those of you for whom building a teaching collection is not especially relevant, I look forward to receiving feedback and encouragement from you, and perhaps some of my ideas and learning about what it is we do at UMass may be enlightening for you in your own work. So, welcome to UMass Amherst, the largest public university in New England. We've got 28,000 students, 1,300 full-time faculty, and the Du Bois Library, which is the largest public academic library in Massachusetts. And it's that hulking monolith on the left-hand side of your screen. The elevators are always busy. That's 26 floors. Also, as our marketing department would desperately like you to know, we are ranked #1 in campus dining. It's our unique selling point. We also have an amazing special collections and university archives known by its acronym SKUA, and that's what I'll be calling it, along with these superlative librarians, just some of whom have helped to build our manuscripts collection are named here. And I'm going to pause right here and say that I am here merely as a spokesperson for this collection and a participant in its creation, but by no means its sole contributor. While I may speak in the first person singular, please know that everything I'm about to say has grown from collaboration and is collective. So our SKUA is well known for its holdings in civil rights history, not to mention the papers of W.E.B. Du Bois himself. But what we didn't have when I arrived at UMass in 2013 was a collection of medieval manuscripts, thereby curtailing our ability to teach the history of the book before the advent of print in the West. However, I was given hope that such a collection extending into the medieval manuscripts period might be possible by this guy. So does anybody here, just by a show of hands, who knows Otto Egge? Excellent, I figured, he's famous here. But for those of you who don't know who he is, in short, he was an educator who lived in the early 20th century, mid-20th century in the Midwest. He gathered a collection of manuscripts, of medieval manuscripts, and as he details in this confessional apology of 1938, he broke them apart and sold and also gave them to educational institutions. And UMass Amherst owns one, which we bought decades ago, one of his portfolios of 50 leaves from his widow. So this brings me to step 1 that you see on this screen, the seed. Start with a seed for your collection, something from which your collection might grow. Now, this does not need to be anything special, and I really want to emphasize that. It doesn't need to be 50 manuscript leaves. It doesn't need to be 1 leaf. It can even be an early edition with some interesting codicological features just sitting out there in open stacks. But identify it as the seed from which your collection might grow. Ideally, it has something relevant to give to this collection. It's related to what you want to build a collection about. That's going to be your nucleus. That moves me on to step 2. You need to use that nucleus or that seed. Get to work showing how much value your collection might have by using whatever you conceive of as its seed or nucleus. So what you're looking at here is one of my classes clocking in some time at SKUA. We did this quite a bit, just sending them up there to look at those Otto Egge leaves. I'm illustrating to SKUA, proving to our librarians and curators that the need was there. Step 3, this is the big one. The next step is to get investments. This can seem like the insurmountable step. This is the one that stops people dead in their tracks if they don't live at an institution where there isn't money set aside for this. But the investment that I have in mind does not need to be major or even to involve raising money. Here's what happened for me. The subject librarian for the history of art emailed us, my colleagues in my department, as he does every semester, and said, hey folks, I've got some money left in our budget for art history books. What books do you want to buy? From the standard places like Yale University Press, look at those catalogs. So I emailed my colleagues and I said, do you guys mind if we buy some medieval facsimiles so I can teach, from medieval objects or things that represent medieval objects? And my colleagues are wonderful and generous, and they said, sure, go ahead. And that was the start of building this collection from the seed. So they were happy to agree, and we used this money for those purposes. I asked SKUA if they'd like to hold these facsimiles so that it would require students to have to go into SKUA itself to look at them. They were very happy to do that because students have to sign in, thereby showing that they've been to special collections. And we've done this a few times now, and I'm just showing you a bouquet of some of the facsimiles that we've got. So now you're moving on to step 4. Look for more. Look does not mean get. It's time for more stuff. So this does not require money. Find out what else your library has that might fit into the collection you're planning. And in my case, I asked Rob Cox, our head of SKUA, the man who says yes, I'm looking at EC, if we could do a shelf audit. Not only did we find facsimiles out in the open stacks, which I asked if SKUA would throw up there into SKUA, they said yes. We also shook loose the item at the bottom of the screen here, which are several quires from a 13th century Parisian-style Bible that people had forgotten that we have. Excitement, that was a good day. That was a great day. Step 5, great, you're getting and finding things that might fill out a collection. Well, the next step is to complement these objects with teaching aids, an important lesson that I learned from my time at Rare Book School. This doesn't require any money. In my case, I reached out to friends and colleagues for donations on Facebook, and I received a homemade wax tablet and ink from a man named Johnny Boatwright, a student of a colleague in Indiana who cut down the wood and actually made the wax to create that wax tablet. And made his own oak ink, which he sent, oak gall ink that she sent to me, as well as a free job lot of parchment offcuts from Steve Harris, a colleague of mine in the English department. All of this cost me $0. Okay. Step 6. Now that you've got a group of objects, it's time to turn that assortment of stuff into a thing, right? Into a collection. When you create a thing, when you create a collection and you give it a name, you create a center of gravity. You create a cause for people to contribute to. So I met once again with Rob Cox, and I asked if we could gather all of these objects into a collection with a name, house them in SKUA, and create a web page to email to people to let them know that all that stuff is there. And he said yes. And that web page is currently under development, but at least I've got a place to send to people. I've got a link to send them. This was a major step that formalized the enterprise of this collection. Step 7. Once again, you need to demonstrate value by using the collection and broadening its user base. Let people know those objects are there. I asked SKUA if I could run a full semester class in SKUA, signaling yet again how much desire there was for medieval teaching objects. Likewise, encouraging colleagues to take class visits there, which they did. They even set aside a special seminar room, so they're really happy to facilitate these activities. Of course, you need to secure more investment. That's step 8. And I want to remind you that this is an ongoing process. So what had changed now was that the word got out, and librarians in the audience will know that the library grapevine is strong. So I started getting emails from other librarians letting me know about little chunks of money they had left over in their budgets that were not going to roll over. And they, like superheroes of the book, pooled their forces and were able to buy us spring 2017, buy us our very first complete medieval codex, a scruffy book of hours as average gets, perfect for teaching codicology. It's got some quire signatures, and best part of all, and why it was cheap, the binding has come away partly, and I can show them quire structure. So, with this spotlight object, the collection was ready for opening day. We held a workshop open to whomever wanted to come, giving them a tour of the new collection, popularizing it, and creating even more demand for class visits. We were really exercising these objects. This brings me to that last step and where we are, spring 2019. With the promise and potential of your burgeoning collection established, you can begin to focus on expansion. And this year, for the very first time, Rob Cox, the director of SKUA, he allocated special funds, so for the first time ever, not leftover money, for the acquisition of 2 manuscripts that you see here. I see this as extremely promising and am gobsmacked by all that our students can learn from these objects. And I'll have more to say about step 10 in my penultimate slide here. So to summarize, find a seed, use it, bring classes in to see it, get investments, leftover money, look for more stuff, do shelf audits, see what else you can put in your collection, ask for donations and get more stuff. Give your collection a name to create a center of gravity. Use that collection, secure more investments, have an opening day, a debutante ball, or a coming out party. And step 10, finally, expand. And you may need to do steps 5 through 8 several more times before those funds are finally allocated to buying your objects. And my final comment, the final ingredient that's not on here, it's community. The magic ingredient is a great community, and none of this would be possible without people who have vision, a will, generosity, and the desire to say yes. Thank you.
Here we go. My name is Hidalgo. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I was told to introduce myself, so I thought I'd do that by doing a little bit of shameless self-promotion. I'm an assistant professor of history at Texas Christian University, and I have my first book coming out in July. It's a study of indigenous maps in colonial Mexico. And this is actually how I got into the subject of what I'm going to talk to you today. Part of my interest in the maps was to learn how these pieces were produced. I was incredibly intrigued by the materiality of the maps themselves, and given the time that I was in graduate school, material studies seemed to be taking a hold within my historiographic discipline, and so one of the first questions I asked was, what about ink? I kept running into ink all over the place. It seemed to be everywhere. It was, let's see, can I point? Yes. It was used to annotate the maps that I was examining. I found it in the paste down of books that I was consulting, to illustrate some of the titles that I was examining also in relation to the maps. Fun little pastimes for some of the readers who like to doodle on the edges of the books. And in general, it seemed to be pervasive in every single aspect of the types of documents that I was consulting. In fact, ink and its partner paper, they seem to be the foundation for the Spanish Empire. So I always found it fascinating that these ingredients were put together on a regular basis, and I always thought, would it be very interesting to develop this into a class assignment? And so, what I have for you today is the kind of structure that I put together to develop an assignment like this. The assignment has to do, I think about it in two parts. The first one, thinking about artisanal knowledge and material culture, which is part of how I got interested in the study of ink. But then a second portion of that, how the ink was used specifically within the realm of the Hispanic world, and the history of the book in the Hispanic world from a colonial Mexicanist. And so aside from looking at printed books and manuscripts, there's also the issue of pictorial records where these inks were used. And so my assignment in part has to do with both of these things. I want to speak right now to the first part. What we have is iron gall ink. It was the substance of choice of scribes and those who were producing manuscripts. It consists of three main ingredients: tree galls, ferrous sulfide, better known during the early modern period as copperas, and then the gum arabic, used as a binder to hold all these materials in place. I didn't know that I could get these items, but Amazon is a great resource, and lo and behold, I was able to purchase everything. The next step from that was, how am I going to bring a classroom to do this experiment? A classroom setting is not really appropriate for that. And so I had to reach beyond my department, and I was fortunate that I met a colleague in the chemistry department who was more than willing to share in that burden and invited me to use her laboratory in order to bring some of our students to mix these ingredients together. What we have is basically a formula. These formulas circulated either as marginal annotations in notarial manuscripts in the Hispanic world, or they were printed in books mostly tied to the art of writing. I've put up an example of one of the simplest formulas that I found so that this would be the basis of what the students would actually use in the laboratory. In the laboratory, I brought my students in. I wasn't really sure what to expect or what we were going to do. The measurements that the formula called for were too large. They were meant for large batches of ink. Instead, we pared that down to smaller sizes, and you could see that the students then were instructed by my chemist colleague in order to put together the mix and start to prepare these ingredients. In addition to mixing the ink, I also brought feathered quills so that we can get a fuller experience about how these actual materials were used. We purchased X-Acto knives. You can see one of the students on the left-hand side arduously tapping away at that feathered quill, and then eventually being able to write with it. That was the first part of the assignment. The second part consisted of teaching the students how this ink was used. And for that, I turned to my special collections. Much like Sonja, I have also been involved in expanding our collections of books printed in the Americas tied to the Hispanic world. And I wanted to show you an example of one of the pieces that we have purchased recently. It's a Nahuatl and Spanish dictionary that circulated and was printed in Mexico City and circulated in the 16th and 17th century as a manual for priests who were converting indigenous people. What I loved about this piece is that, as you can see, it's got all sorts of different annotations. So the second part of the assignment in a different class consists of analyzing the title page. We have a number of Spanish speakers usually in these classes, and so identifying the different layers of annotations where the actual iron gall ink was used is of principal concern. The first layer has to do with the actual printed title page and the ink that was used there, which is different. They have a different sort of formula, but it comes along with the book. It includes the title, the author, woodcut, publishing, and bibliographical information. The second layer has to do with the owners of the book and who held it. And you can see that there are different places where the owners have inscribed their names, either individuals, as we see here, or as part of a Franciscan library, as you see at the top. And the third layer, which is my favorite, has to do with these annotations on the right-hand side. And what I came to discover was that this book had certain portions of it that were prohibited by the Spanish Inquisition in Mexico, and that in fact what we're seeing here are annotations by multiple inspectors who corrected and amended this book on at least 5 different occasions. Once with the book itself, and when we see it, the paleography is not as complex as it might seem here. It's not as clear. I have students working together as a team. I have them analyze these pieces with me in conjunction there, but also with the special, the rare books curator. And I have one other little detail here that I wanted to show you. This is a 4th layer that has, among other things, waste paper that you can see at the top and in the center, and then a little ink smudge there on the title page. To close out my talk, I just wanted to briefly mention some of the things that I appreciated about this assignment, but also some of the things that I think need improvement as I continue to move forward with it. I think getting the students out of the classroom was, even by their own account, one of the most enlightening experiences, especially history students who are used to being in seminar rooms and talking ad nauseum about books, having the opportunity to go to a laboratory. I think that was incredibly compelling. I found that finally, actually producing ink, I understood for the first time some of the things that early modern writers would emphasize. This notion of viscosity in ink that before meant nothing to me. After I wound up producing the first batch of ink, and it turned like the sort of substance that one uses with watercolor, I understood that, okay, it's important that it have a much better consistency. I think I had a written assignment for them as well, but many of the students wound up not exactly knowing how to bridge the practical aspect of conducting this experiment with the readings that I had assigned. So I need to work on that a little bit more. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Suarez. I'm the director of Rare Book School. It's been my high privilege to be associated with the Rare Book School community for the past 9.5 years. And in that time, I've learned a great deal. I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about why I am bullish on bibliography. The future of bibliography in these United States is very bright indeed. It's something we should celebrate, and it's something we should continue to nurture and to nourish. Rare Book School at the University of Virginia is thriving. Last year we ran 41 courses in 9 locations. You can see that we had 745 applicants and 514 students from 12 countries took our courses. Rare Book School is doing a lot of good, largely because of the crackerjack faculty and the exemplary work of the Rare Book School staff. I will prescind from offering you an infomercial. But it's also true that Cal RBS, under the terrific leadership of Susan Allen, is growing and doing excellent work, and they should be commended, and this is partly too why I am bullish on bibliography. But I'd like to highlight just the work of a few practitioners among so many I could have chosen from to show you some of the things that are being done, and then to talk about what some of the prevailing trends are in the teaching of bibliography as I've been privileged to perceive them. So Matt Kirschenbaum and Carrie Krause, who are digital humanists, have figured out, that a maker space in a library need not be only about 3D printing, but could be about other kinds of printing. And so they set up Book Lab using the Book Beetle desktop letterpress of Joseph Beery. That's a common feature of many practitioners who are teaching bibliography in America today. Here you see one of the students participating, and there's the group. And here they did their first printing here, 2 students, and they obviously had to learn how to do a little composition and a little inking and so on. So there they are. The first folio for them is far away, but they're taking the first steps. In Book Lab, they're not only doing printing, but they're looking at the history of technologies for producing texts of various kinds, starting with medieval manuscripts and going all the way through to born digital materials. They're trying to learn how to think bibliographically. It's also true that Ryan Cordell is doing much the same thing at Northeastern University, particularly in his course, The Technologies of Text. Here, students are transcribing a text by candlelight to see how difficult that is, and learning a little bit about the nature, the error-fraught nature of textual transmission, and who knows, there may be a future scholarly editor among their number. Hannah Marcus, looking completely geeky here in this picture in the History of Science department at Harvard, is so gleeful in this picture because she is holding the set of compasses that Galileo presented to his patron, which is very, very cool. But Hannah at Harvard is stressing the fact that the history of science is mediated not just through objects that are scientific instruments as traditionally conceived, but that the scholarly journal, the off-print, the scholarly book, by a guy named Isaac Newton, that these too are scientific instruments and that they too need to be read in their complex and beautiful materialities. And guess what? That reading begins with developing bibliographical literacy. And so a history of science class is teaching bibliography because the students need it to interpret the objects that are part of the transmission of science. Benjamin Norris at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and now on the faculty of Rare Book School as one of our most junior members, has been teaching the bibliography of the Tibetan book, trying to figure out how to apply Western bibliographical methods to non-Western materials, specifically these kinds of materials. What does it mean to try to transpose into a new key the insights of traditional bibliography for materials to which those intellectual protocols have never been applied before? How would we do such a thing? And so Ben has gathered a community of practice and a community of scholars around him in order to develop this over time, considering all aspects of text production in the Tibetan world. So a kind of powerful combination of formal bibliographical analysis transposed into a new key and traditional book history. Holly Schaefer in the Department of Art History at Brown has also been using bibliographical methods, but not on letterpress texts, on the texts that are part and parcel of her discipline, on the production and reproduction of images. Dave Harper, who sits among us today at the United States Military Academy, West Point, has, I understand, been brought up on court-martial for making his students compose type, but he was vindicated. I'm not sure where the miniature printing press here came from. It's very, very small, but Dave, in his penchant for marketing, calls his press Helvetica on wheels, which is really quite brilliant. And here are a group of cadets printing. And he also, wanting to engage them in a full kind of ecosystem of the study of books, brought his students to the New York Antiquarian Book Fair, which I think was really a brilliant thing to imbricate them more deeply into the bookish community. And here you see some of Dave's cadets working at Thornwillow Press, and they are printing Owen's Anthem for Doomed Youth. What a poignant thing this is for a nation at war, at an academy to train officers for combat. So, in this case, Dave is taking his students to a press, but we should recognize that part of our bullishness about bibliography is the new founding of a number of bibliographical presses. Jane Raish at the University of York in England, alumna of Rare Book School, has been instrumental in being a founder of Thin Ice Press, and Ryan Cordell, who was introduced earlier, has been one of the great movers in the most unfortunately named Huskiana Press. But what are the prevailing trends? What does all this tell us? Well, I think we see more and more the fact that two areas of inquiry in the book that were had an antagonism to each other for a long time are now more than on speaking terms. Ladies and gentlemen, they're sleeping together. Bibliography and book history are producing very powerful intellectual offspring. It's also true that for a long time, bibliography was not part and parcel of the undergraduate classroom, and now it is. And this is a profoundly salutary development for the future of bibliography, and I might add, for this society. We see more and more that bibliography has entered the world of the humanities way beyond its traditional domain of Eng-Lit, way beyond its traditional domain of textual criticism. And again, this seems to me really important. When Rare Book School was working with the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation to work on our program on the Mellon Scholars in Critical Bibliography, we told the foundation that our ambition was to reseed the humanities with bibliographically literate, indeed, bibliographically virtuosic young scholars and teachers. And that has been a tremendous success across the disciplines. It's also true that, as you can see from my very brief photo tour, that there's an increasing emphasis on non-Western and non-traditional materials. We're expanding, as it were, the bibliographical canon, and this is very, very good. It's also true that there's more printing happening, and there's much more of an emphasis in what I like to call the Bellinger method, the hands-on investigation, the hands-on interrogation, even as PowerPoint is used ubiquitously, usually to our impoverishment, so too the thrust of needing to handle stuff has radiated through libraries and classrooms across America and has inculcated wonder in many, many individuals. Teaching is more collaborative, I think, than it has been, generally speaking. There's a lot more extramural teaching. There's a lot more teaching that's involving multiple members of the bookish community, not just scholars, but librarians and book artists and artisans, paper makers, people who are treating parchment, type founders, and so on, to include students and give them a greater bibliographical sensibility in all the aspects of making the book a coalescence of human intentions that's produced not by a single individual, but by communities of makers. And finally, teaching bibliography as a way of seeing, not just as a way of perceiving an individual artifact in history, although certainly that. Teaching students how to read the whole book, not merely the words on the page, but also the bibliographical and social codes in all their profound signification. But not only that, but also to understand bibliography as a way of perceiving the world as inextricably tied up in the communal transmission and production of knowledge. I think that there's a new regard in the humanities today for the explanatory force and descriptive power of bibliography. But I also think that this new generation of bibliographers is stressing again and again the ethical dimensions of bibliographical scholarship, of scholarly editing, and of collection development. Whose stories do we tell? And whose do we exclude? And finally, it seems to me that there's a prevailing culture of collaboration. There's a generous sharing in this community. They are galvanized, and they are robust, and they have a sense of mission. Please join me in being bullish on bibliography. Please join me in helping to redouble the efforts of this rising community of scholar teachers who are changing our field and changing it for the good. Thank you very much.
I think we have a lot to process here, a lot to think about, and a lot to discuss. So I'd like to open this up, not just for the typical question and answer where you ask the speakers for further opinions on particular topics, but I'd like to encourage the audience as well to contribute to this discourse. What are the kinds of things that you are experiencing in the classroom, with students, with your colleagues, whether they are members, whether they're collectors, whether they're book dealers, whether they are members of the faculty, whether they're curators or librarians. What is happening out there that can enrich the dialogue that our four speakers have started for us? Please.
There we go. Is it working now? Oh, good. Okay. I just want to say first thank you for the inspirational talk. My name is Chris Lyons. I'm Director of Rare Books at McGill University. Previous to that, I was at the Oxford Library in the History of Medicine. And perhaps I'm preaching to the converted, but my experience as a rare books librarian and as a former teacher has been that sometimes the whole issue of buy-in can at first be quite discouraging because we can have a lot of really interesting ideas, etc., but you will run up against a faculty who often have full curricula and feel that they can't waste their precious time with their students in doing other things. But what I found was that sooner or later, through talking to people and cultivating relationships, you start to get buy-in, and then you start to get a reputation. So what I found is, I started out with a library whose teaching component with the faculty was 0, and then I went to 30 to 40 sessions each academic year. But it started off slowly doing innovative things, interactions with the profs, And the discovery at the end of each term is, as you noted, and one of our speakers noted, you get these wonderful responses from the students saying the best part of this course was getting out of the classroom and doing things. So there is a wave, I've noticed it in the past decade, and to my colleagues in libraries is just be patient but persistent and bullish.
Thank you, good advice. Other comments, questions? Please, Joe.
Yes, I want to thank the whole panel. What a wonderful, wonderful talk, Sonja. It's great to see you since 2 years ago at Rare Book School. One of the things, Michael, that you mentioned the sort of antagonism between book historians and bibliographers. The other antagonism that was not mentioned, maybe sort of implicit in the whole discussion, was between one traditional role of librarians in the preservation of materials so that the ability to touch them and to see them highly restricted. This remains an issue from time to time with loans of books for exhibitions, for example, at the Schroeder Club, as opposed to those librarians who are more interested in disclosing or rather revealing and making available for people to see and touch the originals. There's an implication perhaps that this is melting away by librarians being more interested in teaching, or is that not the case? This could be for any of you.
Jim, I want to respond because I go back to 1970 when I first started in the Beinecke Library as a summer intern, and there were no undergraduates and very few graduate students in the Beinecke. It was not a welcoming place. And over the years, it became clear that this was not a good policy and that we really needed to be more supportive, and that happened. So that now EC statistics are extraordinary. And even with the last renovation, we have a room in which we can do those wonderful kinds of experiments. So we use inks and pigments. It's a wet room. And that is a whole different way of perceiving what the enterprise of a research library is all about. So I think that this is correct. We have a shift, and that's a wonderful thing for bibliography.
I think that there's also been a shift faculty-wise. You see it in terms of my perception, you're on sort of theory to objects. There's more engagement there. There's also word of mouth. No matter how many times a librarian comes up and is convinced that this is the perfect thing, the best way of communication is among peers within the faculty, that they get and they talk and they interact with each other and come around. I think the other thing that's been hard certainly for us, has been that sort of letting go. It takes a lot to let go and be comfortable doing it. But it also means we have to think about material differently. So we're both thinking of it as we are a research library thinking we're going to be here 100 years, 200 years, 300 years. How do we make sure that material is available for future students? And so there is a built-in commitment for conservation, for preservation, and thinking about how we use material. So it doesn't have to be the Beinecke manuscript every time it comes out. It can be, we now have a high-quality facsimile, so that serves a purpose. But we can also look at other objects. So what Sonja showed in terms of the things that you can show with a less than perfect copy is perfect for the classroom. And that sort of like realization there are different types of materials serve different purposes, and also recognizing the audience for students. So you have different types of students and what their purpose is. Are they an undergraduate who you're just introducing? Are they a graduate student who's basically this is their career and their life study? And so being flexible, that's also hard for libraries.
And if I can add to that, and I think also responding to Chris's point, word of mouth is really important. And so I had what we called opening day, that workshop at SKUA. And what I found out from that in speaking to the faculty in the library is that they were getting overwhelmed after that. They blame us a little bit now because they've been oversubscribed, overbooked. And what I think is this. So you were talking about buy-in. It's also what you might think of this as the startup costs of motivation are extremely high because people don't know how easy it is to go to special collections. My students don't even know that. All you have to do is go up there and say, I'd like to look at something, and of course they'll say yes. So I think that's been very important. And then with regard to objects that are falling apart, they represent really good opportunities to have conversations that I would never even think we would have in the classroom. For example, the ethics of conservation. Because that book of ours is now falling apart a little bit, I had my students have a debate as to whether it should be conserved. They all think that it shouldn't be. We should just let it disintegrate. But next time I have that debate, I'm going to ask Lorraine James, our conservator, to participate and to come in and represent that side of the equation.
From a faculty perspective, I think it's incredibly important to establish those relationships with the rare book curators and the librarians. And one of the things that I've benefited from is being able to develop those relationships with people who want students and faculty to come and use the collections. When I started at TCU in 2013, we had a small space and nobody knew about it. I asked my colleagues and they said, what, special collections? So I think there was a little bit of a marketing problem there. They since expanded into a larger room and I see that more of my colleagues have been engaging with that. From a student perspective, one of the responses that I continue to get is, why do we have these treasures here? I can touch them, I can flip through the pages, and in their comments, and their anonymous comments at the end of the semester, many students will often talk about that experience of going to special collections and handling these rare pieces as one of the highlights of their semester.
Please, yes, thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to stay here because it's too hard to get over there. I actually had a question for Professor Drummond and Professor Hidalgo. Have you seen students come back to the special collections? Do you know that if they're doing follow-up work based on your assignments and your classwork?
That's a great question. I know that they have to go to SKUA, to special collections and university archives on their own because it's part of their assignments. And I want them to get used to what it's like needing to sign in, to put your bags in a locker on their own without my tutelage. However, I think you raise a really important point, which is follow through and follow up. And I am going to now, because of your question, email my students the following semester and ask them, have you gone back? It never even occurred to me to do that. And ask them, have you gone back on your own? Thank you for that.
That's a great question. I'm not sure. So I know the following. I know that in my evaluations and my midterms, I include a component where they have to go to special collections and review a piece. I know that that's cheating a little bit, but they do go back. I've seen graduate students go back to special collections after I teach a seminar, but I think that I would be also in a position to do that and kind of email and say, hey, listen, have you followed up with it?
And I think this idea of sending them an email, following through, it's the power of suggestion. They might not even realize that they can go without having a class on those objects. So again, thank you.
So this is one of our big brother, big sister goals in life, is to actually document who's in the classroom and who comes back. There are ways that we're getting there, and students actually are more comfortable with that than I would have expected. But what we often are seeing is it's the investment over the 4 years, so it's not in that semester. It's more in the freshman or sophomore class where it's a drop-in, they're being introduced, then they're coming back for their capstone project or they're seeing your thesis. That's what we're seeing in follow-up. The other thing, going back to Barbara's comment about open and open house, after we reopened, we started doing an open house on the second or third Saturday before the football season started. And the first time we weren't certain what we were going to get, and this was open to all students on campus, undergraduates and graduate students. And over the course of a 3.5 hour, we had 1,200 students come through the door for a visit. And one of the goals was to register them as readers as part of that process, bring them down to the research level, down to the reading room. What's it like to be in the reading room? We had material out for them that was a wide range, so it was to show the breadth and the diversity of the collections that are at the Beinecke, and that sort of like, once again, making it easier for them. Many of those students are hiking up Yale, it's a little insane students, but many of them have never been in a special collection, or why would you do that? Why do you mean I have to leave my bag upstairs? And so just breaking down the barriers was crucial.
John, are you in line? Please.
John Vochtel, the Boston Athenaeum, and also faculty at Rare Book School. Is the mic? Yeah, different. One thread here is the question of how we move from first exposure to dabbling, to familiarity, to fluency, to mastery. And as we saw in the new scholars presentations this afternoon, some kinds of bibliographical scholarship is really hard work and even drudgery at points until you finally break past the barrier into meaningful discovery. And I think, you know, ECU mentioned the sort of master class idea, the thing that's a little outside the curriculum. That's one great idea. Michael, of course, we know that Rare Book School allows for progressive in-depthification as we keep, I have a valid poetic license. I've just moved in my career to a completely different kind of institution. We're talking about academic research libraries. I'm now at a membership library after a career in university libraries, and we're serving families as well as scholars. And it's just sort of delightful to think about another angle here, which is early exposure. And where I've been watching the children's librarian and what she does, and I've been thinking about the conservation lab opening up its doors to have kids come in and experience making paste paper, for example, and sort of thinking about where can we as, sure, we're a scholarly organization, that's our focus. We're research libraries, those constituencies are our focus. But are there things we can do collectively to encourage early exposure as well? Just a thought.
Thank you, John. Barbara, are you in line?
I am, but
Okay,
I'm
please.
Hi there. I'm Christine Davidson, and I'm the very new assistant curator of modern books and manuscripts at the library. And I'm wondering if we could talk just a little bit more about pedagogical philosophy. And ECU touched a little bit in your presentation on the facsimiles that you've created so students can get a little bit more hands-on in the classroom. And I'm wondering, as you know, we move away from this show and tell sort of approach to teaching in special collections, what kinds of approaches are you taking at the Beinecke, and what kind of pedagogical support and training do you provide the librarians and curators who do the teaching?
Short answer is not enough in terms of, I think it's actually reflected across the university as like an investment in time, sort of training of graduate students and early faculty. I think that's an area where we want to improve just getting staff comfortable, just doing public presentations, organizing what's the takeaway. I think the pedagogy part has been fascinating, so we do, like everyone else, we were doing fellowship programs, and we've done open houses for graduate students ahead of the due date to say, hey, you should come by. They're expected to have spoken with a curator to talk about their project and make sure, help them work their way through. But part of it was also the open house again, was a chance for them to come in and just think in a fairly unstressful situation. And one of the things we realized, perhaps not surprised, is how much graduate students need to learn about using an archive, how to think about an archive in a different way. The same thing is probably true about books, but this particular set of students were focused more on the archive. So one of the questions we're developing is, okay, what's the pedagogy? What's the project? We do most of our teaching in the classroom setting. So the class on African American literature in the archives is very much focused on getting into an archive, learning what are the questions you can ask, what answers can you come up with. There was an undergraduate class, but we've done pop-up exhibits where they're expected to select an item or a couple of items and we open up to anyone on campus to come in and participate. We have a grand old time. Staff come out of the woodwork for it. And so it's getting the students to think about material in different ways. And I think the other thing is we'll try almost anything. I mean, there is one of my colleagues, Catherine James, is a force of nature in terms of the types of projects and types of ideas that she has in terms of teaching. One of the things that Barbara's used that Catherine worked with our conservation staff with was a traveling scriptorium. And she can talk, Barbara can talk about
Yeah, the traveling scriptorium is wonderful. It's the people in conservation who have all kinds of things, including inks and pigments. I mean, we spend a lot of time in advanced Latin paleography talking about inks and pigments, and we do a lot of hands-on exercises with quills, and we have demonstrations of how you actually do pigments and get colors. But this is all possible because of the commitment of the director of the library to being creative and to being open to faculty who want to do a wide array of hands-on experiences. And that's absolutely key. So Barbara, please, and then we're going to have one more observation, and then we're going to have drinks.
Can you hear me? It was great to hear, Alex, that you collaborated with Kevin and Sonja, and that you're thinking of bringing a conservator in to have that conversation. Because from what I've observed, undergraduates in particular are interested in thinking about careers. And a professor, that's one path, right? But the more interface they have with a chemist or a conservator or an antiquarian bookseller, an editor, publisher, these are all people they have something to learn from. So they think about the future of their own, their work. And having the ability for them to mix and intermingle with people who not only can instruct them in that class, but maybe go out to lunch with them and talk to them a little bit about what that's like leads to career opportunities. I know from our book school that many of the collections assistants that work for us and followers, I'm looking at you, Scott, have gone on to careers in rare books, but also conservation, the book trade. It's really great to see over time how these interactions have led to careers and real new expertise. And so the more that can be emphasized in these classes, the better I think.
Thank you, Barbara.
Oh, can I add just one really quick thing? One thing that I've had success with is, and this won't work at institutions that don't need interns, but persuade your students, or encourage is the word I was looking for, encourage your students to send a formal email to the head of special collections or an assistant and say, do you need maybe once or twice a week an intern? And that's something they can put on their CV, and it's been greatly appreciated on both sides.
So one final observation, Terry?
Is this on? I think my path has crossed the paths of the majority of the people in the room at one time or another. My name is Terry Bellinger. But a long way we've come. But the single person most responsible, to my mind, for that long and successful way is G. Thomas Tansel, who is with today. Where would we be without him?
Thank you. So I would like to do the final thanks for our panelists, for all of you in the audience for being here and joining us in this dialogue. And I'd like to thank especially Ken Soner of the Thomas J. Watson Library at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who hosted our committee meetings, and to John Neal Hoover, who reactivated the Mercantile Library Fellowship in North American Bibliography. So with that, let us have a drink. Thank you.